Hi, my name's Steve Marler, and I'm a home brewer. I've been brewing for about 8 years now. And like most home brewers, I started doing extract brewing and decided one day that I wanted to go to all grain. But it sounded mysterious. It wasn't an easy process, and I was sort of fearful of doing it. But it's not that hard, and I'm here today to show you that all grain brewing is pretty easy. You have more control over your beer style, and it's a fun process. First thing we want to talk about is some of the equipment that you'll need to do all grain brewing. It's a little bit more capital intensive than extract brewing, but it makes it more interesting. First thing you'll need is an ability to grind your grain. Now, I have my own mill. You can use, most homebrew shops have a mill that you can use, but it's really nice to have your own mill. Once you mill your grain, you don't want it to be floury. Basically what you want to do is just crack the husk so that you can get to some of that good, grainy, the white stuff you see there, and that's where we're going to get our sweet wort that's going to become our beer. You want it to have some coarseness to it with some of the husk of the grain still together to act as a natural filter bed. Now my mill, I've motorized with your standard household drill, which makes it a lot easier and faster. This here is a water filter. If you live in a city area like I do here, it's really good to get the chlorines and chloramines out of the water that they put in it, because that will affect the taste of your beer. Now you can use your standard spring water from a grocery store if you don't want to invest in something like this, but using some type of filtered water will improve your beer immensely. And this is an immersion chiller. We need some way to cool the wort as quickly as possible before we pitch the yeast. I built this just out of your standard copper tubing wrapped around a cylinder and hooked it up with the hoses so it would hook up to the garden hose. And we'll be using that later in the process. The immersion chiller is necessary, I believe, some type of cooling mechanism. The water filter, that's your choice how you want to do that. And same with the grain mill, whether you want to invest in that or not is up to you, but you need some way to grind the grain. Now the other three pieces of equipment will be a necessity for you. This is your basic 3-tier gravity-fed brewing system. As you can see, each container that holds fluid, the fluid will move to the next one just based on gravity. This here is called your hot liquor tank, or where we'll keep our sparge water. This is our mash lauter tun, and of course our boiling kettle. And I'll talk about each one individually. First I want to start off with the mash lauter tun because it's one of the most important pieces of equipment. As you can see, it's your basic cooler, except that it has a false bottom in it. It's basic CVPC pipe, which is slotted with a hacksaw. I put it together and covered it with a mesh just for extra protection from the grain getting in. And it fits right back into our mash tun with the slots going down. It just fits into the cooler with the slots down towards the bottom. This is where we'll be putting our grain, and we'll be mixing it with the hot water to get our mash or saccharification temperature, and we'll let it sit there for a while for all the starches to convert to sugars. Once we're done, and I've done a test to make sure conversion is complete, we want to do what's called sparging, which is basically just sprinkling hot water from here onto the grain bed. And I just got a regular PVC pipe with some holes drilled in it, and we'll just set it on there and let it sprinkle onto the grain bed. And as we're doing that, we're going to drain the wort into the boiling kettle. Now the boiling kettle is just a regular keg that you can get at a salvage yard. I have a nipple welding onto it and a thermometer, but those you don't need. And you can use any type of a stainless steel container just as long as it can hold your whole volume that you're going to boil. I make 10-gallon batches. We're going to be boiling 14 gallons of fluid. So, and this is a 15-gallon keg, so we're just able to hold it. So that's our basic equipment. So now we're going to get started, and today we're going to brew a Belgian triple. It's a fairly simple beer to brew. We're going to mash into a single infusion mash. We're going to put 165-degree water into the grain. That should equalize the temperature to about 148. We'll let it sit there for an hour or so for a complete conversion of the sugars, the starches into sugars. And then we'll begin our sparging technique once that's finished. So let's go. In this recipe, we're putting 25 pounds of Belgian Pilsner malt into our mash tun. All right, we have our grain in the mash lauter tun. Now we need to add our water. We're going to put 1 quart per pound. We have 25 pounds, so that gives us about 6.5 gallons of water. And we're using 165-degree temperature. And when we add it to the grain, that should bring the temperature down to an equilibrium of 148 is what we're shooting for. Okay, we're going to use 6.5 gallons of water, and that's approximately 1 quart per pound of grain we're going to use. The 165-degree temperature we calculated from a basic formula off the net or a homebrew magazine. That should give us our saccharification temperature that we want at 148 degrees. All right, we're going to add our water to the grain. This is one of the best smelling parts of brewing. Grain, and really smells good when you put that water in. I'm going to stir it up some. We need to get that water all the way down to the bottom. Make sure that the temperature's equal all throughout the cooler. Got to get down there, the bottom, break up these clumps. We want to equalize the temperature to the whole mash. In these rectangular coolers, the temperature tends to be lower on the sides, so we need to see if we can equalize it the best we can. But as one of the famous homebrewing books says, relax, have a homebrew, don't worry about it. It will come out good no matter what. All right, now that we got it stirred in real good, I'm going to do some temperature checks, make sure the temperature's equalized throughout the whole mash. Looking for 148. It's just perfect in the middle. What about the side? Little bit too high on the side actually, so let's mix it up a little bit more. Now, if you ever get a mash that you feel is too hot, just take some hose water, cold water, and spray some on it and cool it down if you need to. No big deal. It's just, you want to get the right saccharification temperature. All right, we're looking good. Looking good. All right, looks like we got equal temperature throughout the whole thing. It's about 148 throughout, 148 to 150, it's fine. And what we want to do now is cover it up so that the temperature is maintained constantly. We're going to keep it there for about an hour. We'll do a conversion test after that hour, and if it's converted, we'll start our sparge process. So while we're waiting, let's cut to Jason Oliver, professional brewer, and watch him do some brewing on a commercial system.
I'm Jason Oliver of Virginia. I'm going to talk about my system here and how it is similar and different to a home brewing system. This is a 7-barrel brew house pretty common in the brew pub industry. It brews about 217 gallons of beer at a time, opposed to 10 to 15 gallons you brew at home. The way it starts is, the process starts up here in the mash tun. I mill my grained, or my milled malt over, drops to the top, I mix it with hot water at a given temperature. I set my temperature the night before, and I have a mixing valve up there with a flow meter. So as I'm mashing it, I can control the flow rate, the temperature, and that gives me a uniform mash, while at home, most home brewers will not have that control. Make my mash, I let it sit for an hour and a half, and in that time, the starches are converted into sugar. This is an infusion mash system, and it's based on British technology, opposed to other mash systems could be temperature mash or decoction mash, which are German. But this is the English technology that we use here. After an hour and a half, I recirculate my wort to clarify it. Some people call this warlaufen, others wort recirculation. How I do that is, it comes through, there's a false bottom, leaves a grain behind. The sweet liquid, the wort, which is full of sugars created in the mash, comes through here, through a pump. It's recirculated from the bottom to the top. And all that grain, the husk and the grain itself, actually clarifies the wort. It acts as a filter. And so I check the clarity through the sight glass here. And after about 10 to 15 minutes, the wort is brilliantly clear. At that point, I stop the recirculation and I start filling my kettle up. This process is done purely by gravity because the mash tun is above my kettle, and it takes about an hour and a half to complete. As I'm pulling the wort, the sweet liquid out, I'm also rinsing what's called spargin from the top, and that is done with, so after an hour and a half, the kettle is full, and about this time I want it to be close to boiling. When boil begins, I add my first hop addition, and I boil for an hour and a half, and depending on the recipe, I add hops at various increments, hops being added at the beginning for bitterness, at the end for more flavor and aroma. All recipes are different, and different varieties are used. Okay, after the boil is done, I'll start to whirl my wort around. I'll pull it from the bottom of the kettle through my pump and re-inject it through the side. And what that does is creates a whirling motion. And all the hops and proteins that break out of solution during boil will spin around, and once you cut the whirl off, they'll fall and form a very tight pile on the bottom of your kettle. This is developed by a man in Canada who noticed that he was stirring his tea and all the tea leaves settled in the middle of his cup while he worked for a brewery up there, and applied it to brewing. It's a very simple technology, works very well. It's a way of separating solids from your wort, your liquid. After it's settled into a tight pile at the bottom of the kettle, we'll start to cool it, and we'll cool it through what's called a heat exchanger. And it's a series of very thin plates with seals. Water's flowing in one direction, the hot wort is flowing in another direction. This is a little different from a home brewer's heat exchanger in that some home brewers will use what's called an immersion chiller, which could be copper tubing with water flowing through it that they'll put in the pot itself, or what's called a counterflow heat exchanger. This is a counterflow heat exchanger in the plate variety. So the cooled wort is flowing out of the heat exchanger into your sanitized fermentation vessel. These are what's called CCVs, or cylindrical conical vessels, and they're used both for fermentation and maturation. They're an all-purpose vessel and pretty standard in the brew pub industry. So it's coming through a sanitized tube into the fermenter itself, which has a measured amount of yeast. It's coming in at fermentation temperature, around 68 degrees for ale and about 50 degrees or 49 degrees for a lager. The oxygenated wort is actually going to go through the yeast, mix with it as it's filling up, and fermentation is going to start fairly quickly, and that's why it's very important to add oxygen and have a healthy fermentation, because the longer it sits, the more chance of bacteria taking hold. You want the yeast to be the predominant organism in this fermentation. So these vessels, after fermentation for an ale, most of the alcohol, about 90% of the alcohol, 95% of the alcohol is produced in 3 or 4 days. And then fermentation really slows down. Ales can be produced from start to finish anywhere, depending on your quality and the style of it, anywhere from 10 days to several months, depending on it. But usually most ales are rather quick, and I like to get mine out between 15 and 25 days. A lager, on the other hand, ferments at a much cooler temperature. It's much slower in fermentation, and it's also much slower in maturation. And that will take anywhere above a month to, I'll give it no less than 30 days. Often 40 days to 2 months. This beer I'm going to filter in 2 days. It's already cold, and essentially it's done. Maturation has come along. This is an amber ale. I'm going to filter it on Friday. Today's Wednesday. And you see it has a slight haze. All the yeast has settled out, but that's what's called a chill haze. And that's why beer is filtered at 0 at very cold temperatures, because what happens is that you actually filter that haze out and you'll have a sparkling product at the end of that. Home brewers really cannot do that. And then the other way around it is to give it extremely long time at 0, and sometimes the haze actually will drop out of suspension.
Okay, an hour's passed. Now we need to check to see if we've converted all our starches to sugars. What we're going to do is take a standard white kitchen plate. It needs to be white. Take a spoon. Take a little bit of the fluid out. And then you're going to take your standard medical iodine, the kind you get at any drugstore. We're going to put a couple of drops on the plate. The idea is, like when you're a kid in elementary school or kindergarten and played with potatoes and iodine, it would turn purple because there's starches in the potato. But hopefully this won't turn purple. And as you can see, it didn't. We still got the same color of the iodine. So it looks like we have total starch conversion. So now we're ready to sparge. We're putting about a half gallon of boiling water into this pot, which we're going to add to the mash tun to raise the temperature to 165. This process is called mashing out. And as I said before, it ends all our enzymes conversion. We'll just stir it in so that we get it to raise up, and we'll let it sit for maybe 10 minutes to kill off the enzymes, and then we'll begin the sparging process. Okay, the next step of the process is what we call recirculation. The idea behind that is we're going to pour the fluid out of the mash tun into this container and then pour it back in until the beer that we get out starts clearing. You'll see when we first start it's very cloudy. We want to compact the filter bed so that it starts acting as a filter, and then it will start clearing up. So you just pull. You don't want to start it too fast. You just want to slowly pour it off. It's going to be murky. Actually, you can see a few bits of grain that have made it through the false bottom too. So you want to keep on recirculating until it clears up. So you get a real murky, cloudy. We want to get it so it's clearer. So we'll continue the recirculation process until it looks like it's cleared up. I believe the German term for this is called Vorlaughing. if you ever see it in a book or a magazine. Okay, beer is looking fairly clear now. I don't see a lot of things floating in it. So I think we're done with our recirculation process. We'll add this last amount back to the mash tun. And we'll begin our sparging process. Okay, now we're going to start the sparging process. We've loaded this cooler here with 175-degree water. We'll turn the valve on. You want to get it so it's just sprinkling the grains, just dripping on top. You always want to keep a level of water just above the grain bed. And we'll open up the mash tun. So now we'll start draining our wort into the boiling kettle. Okay, you want to make sure that you have the sparge water level so it's above your grain level at all times. So you need to adjust the fluid flow. Now you sparge until you have enough volume that you want to start boiling with, which is what I do, or you can also take a reading with your hydrometer, and if it gets down to around 1005 or 1000, then you can stop your sparge there. And the reason for that is that over-sparging will leach tannins for the grain and give your beer a tannic flavor, and you want to avoid that. Alright, we're draining our mashed lauter tun into the boiling kettle, and then we're going to bring this to a boil. We're going to put about 14 gallons in here and boil down to 12. This here is a device I made so that I know I have marks along here, so I know where my 14-gallon mark is right here. So any simple device that you can use so you know how much you're draining in would be helpful. Well, while we're waiting for this to drain and boil, let's go back and visit with Jason Oliver and see what he's brewing.
Okay, this beer, this cloudy beer here is my Kolsch beer. It's cloudy due to the German yeast strain. It's what's called a not flocculent strain, or non-flocculent. Flocculation is the settling of the yeast, so a non-flocculated yeast is will retain in suspension. It's very crisp. It's brewed almost like a lager. It's actually closer to a lager than an English ale. It's fermented at a much cooler temperature, around 60 degrees, opposed to 68, 69 for an English ale. And it takes much longer to time than a lager itself. This is my ESA, my extra special ale. It's an amber ale. It is one of the best sellers here. The yeast in this one is very flocculent. It's all settled out, but it has a little bit of chill haze. But that will filter out when I filter it at about freezing. This is my stout, black in color due to the malt that I use. I use a little bit of roasted barley and a little bit of black malt, and that will turn this brew black in color. You don't need much, about 15% of the total grist will turn a brew this color. This is my Oktoberfest lager. This has been in the tank for about 40 days. It'll be in the tank for another couple weeks. And this is brewed in the style of Märzen. It's a German lager style. It's kind of an amber lager. And this is a little cloudier than my other amber due to the yeast as well. This has a lager yeast, which is not flocculent as well, and also takes much longer to mature than an ale. So depending on what style you want to brew, there's so many different parameters in changing a recipe in your brewery. What malt you use, what hops you use, and most importantly, what yeast you use. The yeast will give a huge flavor impact on your brew. But just depend on different suppliers of malt, different origins will make a huge difference on flavor. Water also has a huge impact. Everyone's water is different, at least in different municipalities, and beer is essentially 95 depending on the style, or so percent water, and depending on the mineral content, it will have a huge impact on your flavor. It's very subtle, but it definitely is a factor. The hops you use, some hops are German varieties, some are British, some are Czech, some are American, and depending on what hops you use and when you add them, will have a huge impact on your flavor as well. Once again, I'm Jason Oliver, head brewer at the Virginia Beverage Company. Enjoy your brewing. Cheers.
Okay, we're getting close to boil. But as the wort boils, you're going to see that it builds up a lot of scum, which is actually protein. And you want to get rid of that for two reasons. One, that too much protein in your beer will cause chill haze once it's done and it's in the bottles or keg and you've chilled it. So we want to eliminate as much protein on the top as we can. And it also causes a lot of surface tension, which leads to boil over. And we don't want to lose any of our beers, so we want to prevent boil over. Don't want to get rid of all the protein because the yeast needs some of the protein for its metabolism. But you don't need all this scum, so we're going to get as much out as we can. And I use this this thing I got at the local kitchen store as my scum skimmer. Okay, it's very important when you get your boil going that you have a good rolling boil, because when we add the hops, it helps get the alpha acids out of the hops, it helps drive off some of the volatiles we don't want in the beer, and it helps to coagulate the proteins that will drop out when we cool it. So when you boil, make sure you get a good rolling boil, but make sure you watch out that it doesn't boil over. Okay, we've been boiling our wort for a half hour now. We're going to make our first additions of hops. I'm using whole leaf hops, Styrian Goldings, and we got 3 ounces that are going in. We're going to boil it for another hour now, and we'll make 2 more hop additions later in the boil. Okay, another half hour's gone by. We got a half hour left in our boil, and we're going to do our second hop addition. This time we're adding 2 ounces of the same hop. It's a Styrian Golding leaf hop. Okay, we got to get ready for cooling because we're getting close to the end. So 15 minutes before the end of the boil, we got to put our immersion chiller in so that the hot wort will sterilize the chiller. So we'll stick that in. And I've also added some Irish moss to the boil to help coagulate some of the proteins and drop them out when we cool. My immersion chiller has a pre-chiller on it, which is just another coil hooked in line that when we hook the hose up to, the water will run through and start cooling the wort. When the temperature drops down to 100, I'll put this pre-chiller in an ice water bath, because on a summer day like today, the groundwater just isn't cool enough to drop our temperature down to where we need it to pitch the yeast. Okay, we have our last addition of hops to go in. These are leaf hops again, but this time I'm adding some Sots hops. We've got 5 minutes left, and that's primarily just for a little bit of nice Sots aroma to the beer. That's what it will add to it. So 5 minutes left, and then we'll start our cooling process. Okay, we've cooled our beer. Now we're ready to start filling up our fermenters. Okay, so it's been a long day. We've mashed, we've boiled, we cooled, but we still got a few extra things to do. We have to aerate our wort. We need air in the wort for yeast metabolism. It's very important. A lot of people don't put enough oxygen in their wort, and the yeast lags, and that can cause bacteria to form and ruin your beer. So there are a couple ways you can do it. A real cheap and expensive way is to take a piece of copper pipe like this, drill a couple of holes at the end, put a piece of rubber tubing on it, and stick it onto your boil kettle or a racking cane, however you're getting the beer out into the fermenter, and just let it ride. And as the wort comes through, it will suck in air and put enough oxygen in there for the yeast. Or you can go to your local homebrew store and buy a device such as this. It's just a regular oxygen canister and an aeration stone. Just throw it in your wort and you'll let it go for about 30 seconds. That will introduce a healthy amount of oxygen in the wort for your yeast. Once you're finished with the oxygen, pitch your yeast. As you know, different yeast for different styles. General rule, the more yeast the better. If you're going to get a slap pack, make sure you grow it up so you have enough yeast for your 5 gallons, 10 gallons, whatever you're doing. Stick your airlock on and you're ready to roll. I'm going to ferment this beer for probably 2 weeks, transfer it into another carboy and let it sit for another week or so. And then I'm going to cold condition it for a while so that it really has a nice mellow flavor. I love homebrewing. I think it's a great hobby. I hope that this video has been helpful to you and that you'll give all grain brewing a try one day. Or if you don't, if you've never brewed at all, try some extract brewing. It's not as long as a process and you'll still get some great results. I enjoy this hobby a lot. I enjoy the fruits of my labor and I hope you do too. Thanks a lot. Bye.